If you're a music fan, then you are probably aware of all the different versions of particular albums, from the original that may have been pressed in the 70s or 80s or the 90s to the various number of remasters that have been produced. Sometimes they're just a money grab, and then sometimes they actually have better sound quality. Unfortunately, for the most part, it turns out that the ones that have the best sound quality are the original versions, the ones that were made in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. You've probably made your purchase decisions based on the expectation that these remasters and even these high resolution HD track, ultra lossless streaming versions of these albums were really better quality than the original version, but you'd probably be wrong. In today's video, I'm going to explain to you what the loudness wars is, what compression is, what dynamic range is, and why it should matter to you, and how you can save your money and probably get the older stuff and be much happier. Dynamic range can pretty easily be defined by the difference between the quietest part and the loudest part. So if I'm talking to you like normal and then all of a sudden I scream really loud or start talking really loud, okay, well, then that dynamic range is kind of low. But if I'm super quiet and I don't make a sound, and then all of a sudden I start talking, that's louder dynamic range. The difference between these dynamic ranges is the difference between a real strong gut punch of a snare or the attack of a cymbal, the shimmer of a cymbal, the body of an acoustic guitar, and even the emotion of a vocalist. With low dynamic range, you're missing pretty much the majority of that. And it really does, at least in my opinion, take out the emotion of the music that you're listening to. What I'm going to do now is play you an example of an uncompressed clip versus a compressed clip. And the former is going to have a higher dynamic range, where the latter is going to have a lower dynamic range. So let's start off with the higher dynamic range first. Now let's play the compressed or lower dynamic range version. All right, that sounded terrible. Now that's the difference between high dynamic range and low dynamic range. You notice all of the air from the instruments is missing, the attack, the punch, the weight. It's just not there with the compressed version. My favorite genre of music is the 80s, and I often get ridiculed for it. But I gotta say, the reason, partly at least, is because it's very well recorded and it has great dynamic range. And in fact, the 80s tend to have the better sound quality in terms of dynamic range than more recent music, certainly after about the mid 90s. Dynamic range for an album can often be summed up in a single value. And while I don't necessarily think it's the absolute best way to determine the quality of a song or an album, it's a very good way to get an initial cut. Hey, this has really high dynamic range. More than likely, it's recorded and produced well. If it has low dynamic range, then the opposite is probably true. So let's take a look at some real world examples. On the x-axis, there are various albums by different artists. On the y-axis, we have the dynamic range. And all of these scores came from the dynamic range database. So if you go to the dynamic range database and you search for an album, in this case, I'm looking at Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, you can see there's a whole list of various album versions. The blue line indicates the original release and shows the dynamic range for each of these artists and albums. And the orange is the remaster version. You'll notice that almost every one of them has significantly less dynamic range compared to the original release. In the 80s, albums routinely had dynamic range values between 11 and 14. And then by 2005, many albums were a dynamic range of 6 or even lower. That's not mastering, that's just flattening. And you may be wondering why. Why did engineers choose to go this route? Well, there's a few different reasons, and I don't claim to be an expert, but I've been around enough to understand. So I'm going to relay to you my understanding of it. If you got any comments, leave them in the comments section below. In the late 80s and early 90s, as CDs took over and radio ruled the charts, the music industry stumbled on a discovery. Songs that were remastered louder tended to grab attention more quickly, especially when played back on FM radio in noisy environments or on cheap personal devices. If you've watched enough of my videos reviewing different loudspeakers, you probably heard me mention that in a sighted test, if it's not level matched, most listeners are going to choose a speaker that's louder because louder stands out and tends to grab your attention more. This also applies to speakers that have a high frequency bump. That's a showroom sound. So when you listen to that speaker in a showroom against a speaker that is considered more neutral, especially through the high frequency region, you're probably going to choose, at least initially, the speaker that is louder in the high frequency. The problem is you take it home and it becomes fatiguing and you probably no longer like that speaker. For this reason, record labels told their engineers, hey, we don't really care about the dynamic range anymore. Pump that sucker up, man. Those are rookie numbers. You got to do better than that. So they increased the output overall and squashed the dynamic range. And then by the mid 90s, everybody was in what we considered the loudness wars. And most of the albums at that point were just mastered to the point where they're brick walled, meaning that this super compressed and there's almost no dynamic range, if any at all. Now, what I'd like to give you an example of Michael Jackson's Wanna Be Starting Something from his Thriller album. And it's one of my favorite songs. It's one of my go-to demo tracks when I'm evaluating a speaker system because I know it very well, but also because it has a lot of different effects in it, okay? So we're going to start off with the original release. This is the spectrum of the track. What we can see here in blue is the song itself, and in gray surrounding it is no song, okay? So if you look in these sections in between, these little peaks right through here, and there's some gray in this area, this indicates that there is dynamic range between these passages and even up to here. Now, if these waveforms were sitting up here at this 1.0 line, that would mean that we have what is called brick walled. That means that there is pretty much no life on the track anymore. Everything is just gained up so loud that there's no additional headroom. Now, if we look at the 2008 remaster, which is the 25th anniversary release, you can see that this is indeed brick walled. I mean, this album is, man, it's just cranked up to the max. And if you listen to these two, which unfortunately I can't play you back to back, then you can tell a huge difference. Of course, in loudness, right? For sure. But if you turn the volume down of the remastered one to kind of emulate the loudness of the original release, you're going to immediately notice the difference in the overall weight, the punch, the emotion, the attack, the decay even of the two different versions, with the original sounding much better. There was a website called hdtracks.com or .net, and I used to go to it, right? And the idea was that you were paying for a higher quality version of an album that you really loved. The issue was that really what was happening is you were paying for an upsampled version of a really shitty remaster. So for example, the Michael Jackson's Thriller album, and I just gave you an example of one particular song. You could have the original 1983 pressing, and then you could have the 2008 remaster. You could go to hdtracks.whatever, buy the higher sample rate version with higher bit rate as well, and you assume that you're getting a better quality version, when in fact, it could very well be that all you're getting is the poorly remastered version, just upsampled. Now, I personally ran into this with Rage Against the Machine's self-titled track, and I want to say it was like around 2008 or so when I realized this. Now, it may have been off because my brain's a little bit fuzzy from that time period, but that's when I first noticed that this scam, if you will, really became more prominent. There were a lot of albums that I was looking on there, and they used to display the year that the album came out. So, for example, with Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, the original album came out, I believe, in 1977, but you can find a 1977 master for a CD version, and this shows that it has higher dynamic range according to the dynamic range database. Now, if you were to go spend your money at HD Tracks, you would be getting a lesser version. As you can see here, the dynamic range is lower than the original master was. With this in mind, I quit buying high resolution tracks. And then was it like around 2015, maybe give or take, we started getting Spotify and Tidal and Qobuz and all these different streaming services that offered lossless streaming, which is great, but they also offered high res version, which can also be great. But the problem there is that you don't know for sure which version you're actually getting a high res version of. Meaning, are you getting a high res version of the original or are you getting a high-res version of a remaster? And that's really the crux of the issue here is when you're streaming or when you're buying, you've really got to be cautious about what you're buying. And in some cases, you might be streaming or buying a high res version that is nothing more than just an upsample version of an already crappy remaster. Now, of course, you can have albums that are just junk to begin with. One particular album that I think many people are aware of is Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication. This album was produced by famed producer Rick Rubin, but on the internet, it's widely regarded as a terrible master. There's another one by Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory. That's a great album that I do enjoy. Some great throwbacks like Wonderwall and Champagne Supernova that I really enjoyed as a 8th, ninth grader. I've spent a lot of time digging down rabbit holes trying to find good remasters. They flat out don't exist. And the original was so bad, I don't know if there can be anything done to it to make a remaster better than the original. Because in these cases, the original recordings were already just bumped up beyond belief. So in some cases, you're not going to get anything better than the original anyway, and the original is already garbage. So how do you figure out what albums are the best ones and what to stream? Well, as I said earlier, you have a website called Dynamic Range Database, and I'll put the link in the description section below. Now, here I've already searched for the Thriller album by Michael Jackson, and you've got all the different versions. You've got a Japan, a Thriller 40, a Brazil release, a de-emphasized CD release, Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab, SACD version, but you've got all sorts of different versions. Here's a Cobuzz, and so it's interesting that this Cobuzz is showing up as low dynamic range. Suffice it to say, if you go to this website, you can spend hours trying to track down the best version for your tastes. And some cases, what I've had to do is go on eBay and buy certain versions, or I go to discogs.com, which is a used CD, vinyl, tape, cassette, all sorts of different media website. So I'll go there and find a specific version that I found on Dynamic Range Database with a high dynamic range, and then I'll order that and I'll rip it myself or I'll do whatever I need to do. Another option is to go to trusted websites. So one website that I really like going to check out is the Steve Hoffman forums. You can also look for trusted mastering engineers. Names like Steve Hoffman, Kevin Gray, Bob Ludwig, and Bernie Grundman are often associated with well-mastered releases. Another option is to buy early pressings or audiophile editions. Now, you can find these, again, used condition. There's a store in Nashville called Phonolux Records. I just went there a few weeks ago. I found these gems in their collection. Somebody had sold their own private collection to them, and I found some early releases, and I was stoked. You can also look for albums from labels such as Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab, MFSL, Analog Productions, and DCC Compact Classics. They are all known for preserving dynamic range, in addition to providing some good master engineering techniques to improve the overall tonality even. As far as streaming services go, I think my general rule of thumb is that anything that shows 1995 or after is probably a bad version. So for example, if I go to Apple Music, I can do view credits and it will tell me the year of that album. If I'm listening to Rage Against the Machine self-titled, which came out around 92, maybe 93, and it says 2007 on it, then odds are it's the remastered version and it's probably not going to have good dynamic range. Same thing for Spotify, Qobuz, Tidal, etc. Now, you can use Dynamic Range Database to help you kind of narrow in, but that would be my general rule of thumb. If it's mid-90s or beyond and you know the album originally came out before then, it's probably a bad remaster, and maybe try to find the original version to stream instead. Now, this isn't bulletproof, and none of this means that dynamic range is the only way to determine if an album is good or not, at least in terms of the recording quality. But I will say that it tends to be a very good pointer, and in my opinion, makes the easiest way to determine if you're getting a good quality album or not. So with all that said, I'm out. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed this, and keep rocking. Talk to y'all later. Peace.